Hello, present and future game developers. It's your host, Chris DeLeon here. If you've been following this podcast, you may remember about a month ago I shared Tomo Moriwaki's December visit to our Gamkedo Game Developer Club as one of the weekly podcast episodes, rather than my usual interview format. Today's episode is our Gamkedo Club's February guest speaker, David Mullich. David's been making games professionally for over 3 decades, including work for projects by Activision, Disney, Electronic Arts, and the 3DO Company. It also includes hits like DuckTales, The Prisoner, Heroes of Might and Magic, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Vampire, The Masquerade Bloodlines, and literally dozens more. He's the co-creator of the Boy Scout of America's Game Design Merit Badge and presently is lead faculty of game production at the LA Film School. Before I switch over to David's presentation, just for a minute, I want to real quickly share what our club's mission is because it's something I think may be a good fit to help some of you out there along your game development journey. Gamkedo Game Development Club brings beginning game developers together for team projects. Teams of beginners following this process have completed over 150 games at 2 different universities. But now through this Gamkedo Club, for the very first time, the full process and member benefits are available to people who aren't at any university. In the past 4 months alone, we've already wrapped up 8 team games, we have 3 more currently in development, and another one will be pitched to begin next week. So if you're in Los Angeles, come by our weekly meetings anytime for free to network or just to see what we're up to. No matter where you are in the world though, you can become one of our long-distance members to participate online in developing games with your fellow club members, expanding your network and skills at the same time by practicing with our people, adding variety to your portfolio year-round at a scale that's much harder to do solo. Find out more about our club or join us as a member at LAGameDevs.com. That's LA like Los Angeles, GameDevs, short for Game Developers Plural, LAGameDevs.com. Without further ado, here's our club's latest monthly guest speaker.
Hi everyone, I'm David Mullich. I've been in game development for 37 years now. I got my start way back in the early days of home computers. How many of you have played video games growing up? All right, all of you. Great. When I was growing up, the only video console there was to play was the Magnavox Odyssey that had table tennis on it and a shooting gallery and not really much else. In fact, it didn't even have color capabilities because it was too expensive for the electronics. What it would come with was color overlays that you put on the screen, and that would be your background, and then it would just have little white rectangles going across it. That's what I played when I was a kid. And so I never conceived that there would ever be someone whose job would be to actually design games because the games are so simplistic. Actually, my ambition was to be a board game designer because I played a lot of just about every classic game there was. Risk, Monopoly, Mousetrap, Life, you name it, we had it and I played it and I started making my own board games using crayon and pencil. My dad was an engineer, so he brought home all this blueprint paper and I'd use that to draw my game boards on. But when I went to college, I also didn't think that there was really a job for a board game designer. I wanted to be one of 3 things. I either wanted to be a writer, an artist, or a filmmaker. The one thing I did know was that I was going to go to Cal State Northridge because we lived about a mile away from the campus and I could ride my bicycle there. I didn't have a car yet and I graduated high school. So I went down to pre-register at the radio, television, film department and I saw the line of people waiting to go in all the way around the building. And I didn't have the faith to believe that I and all these other people would be getting jobs in the entertainment industry. Mm-hmm. So I decided I'm going to be a little bit more practical. I had an undeclared major, just started taking a lot of classes. And then one day I took a computer class. Not because I was especially interested in computers, but because I was a geek. Mm-hmm. I like Star Trek. I like Lord of the Rings. But I especially like Star Trek. I like the computers there, so I wanted to learn more about them. And first couple of weeks, I did not understand it at all. The whole idea of taking tasks and breaking it down to simple steps and problem solving and doing flow charts and working in code. I mean, why can't I talk to the computer just like they did on Star Trek? And then one day, I don't know what it was. It was like someone just flipped a light, just like that, light switch. I started to get it. And I started to figure out programming, and I started to program. And then one day, I was sitting in the computer lab, waiting to use the printer because there was one shared printer among all of us. And as I was waiting to do my homework, I was just starting to tap my fingers. And I put my fingers on the board and I started tapping on the keyboard and I started creating a Star Trek game. And as I was creating it, I realized what I was doing was kind of creating a story, but it was an interactive story because the player was involved in the story. The player was taking actions, making decisions that would affect the outcome of a story. And I suddenly realized that there could be such a thing as interactive stories, and that a computer was just as valid a creative medium for creating stories as was a typewriter, an easel, or a camera. So I got real excited about this idea, and I immediately went down to the registration office and changed my major to computer science. Then it was math classes, and compiler construction classes, and taking classes in Fortran, and then taking a class in COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language, used by banks and the government and banks, just for doing like accounting stuff. But what I was doing with it, I would take it and use it to print pictures of the Starship Enterprise and doing computer poetry. And then my professor caught me. And he pulled me over. I said, I want to speak to you. I thought, I'm in trouble now. No, it turns out he wanted to offer me a job. He and a couple of the other professors owned a computer store, the second computer store to ever open up in Los Angeles, Rainbow Computing, which was just across the street from the campus, and he offered me as a job as a clerk. Now, this was 1979. There's some significance to 1979. That was the year that the trinity of home computers came out. Commodore PET, the TRS-80, and the Apple II computer. And at this store, they sold the Apple II computer. So I got hired on as a clerk, which is a great job to have. I go to my classes, go to the library, then afterwards come over, across the street to the store, and work in the store where I'd help sell the equipment. Back then, people bought computers because they were hobbyists. Originally, they bought them as kits. And a lot of engineers and more sophisticated programmers would buy these kits and try to put them together. Then they tried to figure out what use there was for them because there wasn't even an operating system in them. So some of the computers, it just had lights and switches that you just go and that's how you program them. You flip all the switches. Eventually, they did come out with interfaces where you could plug it into your television and with keyboards. And if you wanted to save anything you created, you bought an audio cassette recorder with two wires, one going into the mic, one going into the earphones. When they did have operating systems, if you wanted to save something, you type save, press record on the cassette recorder, and it would beep and boop all the way out to the audio tape. Save it. Then when you want to load it back in, you press play, press load, play the beeps and boops back in, and that's how it loaded back into the computer. But people really didn't know what to do with it. Fortunately, a lot of computer magazines came out. There was Creative Computing. My favorite name was Dr. Dobbs' Journal of Computer Orthodontia. And it would come up with all these tips for how to use these computers. It would even have code in it for typing your own checkbook programs, because that was real important to use a computer for, or storing your recipes. And there was even games on it. So what people would do, they would buy the magazines, go home, type in the code in BASIC, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code, an early language used for beginning programmers. And they'll type these programs in, maybe make some modifications. And then what they would do, they would go and they would maybe make some of their own, maybe make some tweaks to it, save it out to audio tape, maybe make several copies of the audio tape, print out labels on Avery labels, put those on, Xerox some documentation, put it in Ziploc baggies they got from the store, bring it to their local computer store. And that's how they would sell them. And they would sell them and, maybe earn a couple of bucks on the side. The store I worked in, we sold our customers games. And we eventually had a mail order catalog so that we would sell all over the country because people wanted software and there weren't any software companies. Well, some software companies did eventually start up. One of our customers got laid off from UCLA. Didn't know what to do at first. Then he got the idea of starting his own software company that he ran out of his apartment. And he asked me if I'd be interested in writing some games for him. Would I be interested? Sure, why not? So that's what I would do. I was still a college student on the side, just starting creating my own games. First game I made was actually a sequel to a game that the owner, his name was Sherwin Steffen, and his partner Steve Pedersen. Their company was called Eduware because they were primarily focused on educational software, but they also made games. And they had a role-playing game called Space. Very first game I did was kind of an expansion module to that I did based upon an anthropology class I took. So it was all about colonizing a planet and then developing it. And that took me all of 2 weeks to do. I made this game, I went to publish it, and I think I made a couple $100 off of it, which back then, that was great money. My second one was oil crisis was going on then, so based upon an economics class I took, I made a economic simulation called Windfall. And I did that one in about a week. That sold well too, another couple $100. And then the final one I made was based upon running your own television network. And that was something I did in 3 days because they called me up like on a Monday and said they're attending the San Francisco Computer Fair that weekend and they needed a new product to show off. So quickly thought up the idea, did it in 3 days, and we went and sold it. I made those 3 games while I was still a student, and then when I graduated, they offered me a full-time job as a game designer programmer. That's how I broke into the game industry. Eventually, we got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we started bringing on more programmers. And my boss said to me, we could be much more effective if instead of both designing and programming games, you just design them and you'd have people working under you programming them. And I did not like that idea at all because I was this lone wolf, very shy, very introverted. Didn't like the idea of working with anyone else, but I kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into the position. And after a while, I realized I liked it because I discovered I wasn't really bossing people around. I was collaborating with them. And we were dividing up tasks. And yeah, it did make me much more productive. And I found it was really cool to work together in a group to create something that other people could enjoy. I liked that very much. And then eventually it rose up and I became a vice president of the company. We eventually got to be about 60 people. Produced a number of games. Probably my most famous game then was based on the television show The Prisoner. How many of you have seen that show? All right, one of you has. How many of you have heard of it? All right, one has. It's a lot of people consider it, including me, the greatest television show ever made. It was about a spy. Well, at least we assume he's a spy. His background's kept secret. He resigns from his position, but as he's packing up to go someplace, he gets kidnapped, taken to a remote resort where he's just given a number, just referred to by a number, and they spend the entire 17 episodes. This is a British series, so limited number of episodes, just trying to figure out why he resigned. Trying to break him down, and he's refusing, and it's really all about individuality against the authority, which as a recent college graduate was a theme that really appealed to me. I really wanted to do a game based upon it, but back then we weren't very sophisticated about things like copyright and trademark and intellectual property rights, so we just created the game. I didn't want to imitate the show directly because I did have some sense of intellectual property protection. We still called it The Prisoner, but what happened was our marketing person called up ITC, which was the British production company on the show, and said, "Would you object if we did a prisoner-themed restaurant?" They said, no, go ahead. And so they took that as meaning, yeah, we can make a game. And that's what we did. It was a successful game because the way I designed it wasn't built around any particular mechanic, and it wasn't based upon any genre. Rather than trying to imitate something else, I was trying to create an experience. The experience of feeling paranoid and that people were out to get you and that everything you did would always send you back to square one. Even though there weren't many rules for making games at the time, it broke every single rule in the book about balanced gameplay and being fair to the player and all that. And I just sat there and just was stream of consciousness designing and programming as I went. And I think I worked on that for like 2 months. When it came out, it turned out to be a really big hit and cult classic. And I attribute that to designing games to create a particular player experience and just letting that take you wherever it goes. Was with Edgeware for 5 years until we were bought out by a accounting software company from back east that wanted to break into the home market. They thought the best way to do that was to buy a company that was already in the home market. So they bought us and immediately slapped their packaging, their accounting packaging on all of our games and educational products. And you couldn't distinguish it from their accounting software. So guess what happened to our sales? Right down into the toilet, and within a year we were out of business. So that began a journey for me where I formed my own company with a couple of other Edgeware people. We were making 3D simulations, some of the first 3D first-person simulations. One of our business partners was a NASA JPL scientist who was doing this on the side. We created a outdoor wilderness survival simulation that we almost convinced the Boy Scouts to accept as one way of fulfilling the Wilderness Survival Merit Badge. It was a really great game. We had a manual that went with it that taught you all about survival. The only problem was distribution, because here we were. There was no App Store at the time. There was no Steam. And in fact, there wasn't even an electronics boutique or any major game stores. There was just all these little mom and pop computer stores all around the country. We had no way to get in touch with them. So what we needed was a distributor, someone who takes product from a manufacturer and puts it in the retailers. We're on the hunt for a retailer. And fortunately, there was this company out there that was a game company that was already very successful in distribution. And they wanted to actually expand and accept other products to distribute. It was a company only 2 years older than us. You may have heard of them. They were called Electronic Arts. We signed up with them and we became their very first affiliated label publisher. Being their first, they made all their mistakes on us. Our game was selling very well. We were manufacturing and shipping to them like 10,000 units at a time. And then after we got one really big order, we started making another 10,000 units. We went to call them up to say, got another 10,000 units coming our way. And they said, hold the presses. We kind of overestimated the sales on this. So not only are we not going to accept that 10,000 units, you're going to buy back the 5,000 units that you had most recently shipped us. They were much bigger than us. Not much we felt we could do about it. So we bought back the units and went and tried to find another distributor. But unfortunately, that put us in a financial hole that drove us out of business. I spent 2 years actually working without a salary. All the money I made from the sale of the previous company all went to paying for my apartment and my other expenses while trying to start up this other company. But that's the thing about game development. Some people, if you're very lucky, you earn some money. But the fact is maybe about 20% of games break even made by the big guys. And so if you're one of the lucky few that makes a really big hit, you can earn a lot of money from it. That doesn't mean your next game is going to be a hit, or your next game, or your next game. Even the more successful people in the game industry, their income goes up and down and kind of eventually evens out so that probably most of us just earn a middle-class income. Very few people get rich working in the game industry. You do it because you love it, not because you expect to make a lot of money on it. In fact, I recently visited the home of one of the most famous people in the game industry. I'm not going to say who it is, because this is being recorded, but a very famous person. He made one of the best-selling games of all time. I was expecting him to live in a mansion. I went to his house. It was no different than my middle-class house. Because that was many years ago they sold this big game, and he's had us up and down since then, like I have. Anyways, from there, I didn't know what to do. I was in my apartment, kind of sitting there on the floor, figuring out what my next move was, watching my dwindling savings go down. And then a programmer who worked for me at Edgeware called me up and said he just saw an ad in the newspaper for a position to probably be interested in. It was for a software development specialist at the Walt Disney Company. I immediately applied for it. They brought me in, asked me if I could name all 7 dwarves, and I could because I was a Disney nut. And they hired me on as a software development specialist at Disney Computer Software, which actually was, they didn't use those terms then. It was a licensee that would license its characters out to other software publishers. And they hired me as what would soon be called a producer, someone who was a liaison with game studios that are making product. And it was great. I was sitting there reading comic books and watching movies and just reading up on all the latest Disney stuff. And my job was basically, I would supply the developers with whatever they needed. Film scripts, character sheets, music, you name it. And then every once in a while they send me builds and I look at it and try to figure out what would Walt want. We used to say that Walt would whisper in our ear at nights and tell us what it is we're supposed to say. We worked with Nintendo developers a lot. One of the games I worked on was a game called DuckTales, based on the TV series. The DuckTales game that our liaison worked on turned out to be a great classic, although I didn't know it at the time, but glad to be a part of it. I worked on Dick Tracy, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And then Disney started to realize, you know what? We can make a lot of money if we actually publish these games ourselves. So it went into the business of publishing them on home computers. Wasn't quite ready to dip its toe into the console market. That's really complicated because the console manufacturers control it so heavily. They control what products go into it. And then when you do develop products for consoles, their QA staff looks at it and typically when you get feedback back, you get like 3 reams of paper of comments about things they want to change in it. So we weren't ready to do that, but we were a computer publisher. We made computer games based upon DuckTales and same properties we did on the Nintendo. And we got to be really, really successful at it. So successful that suddenly every other manager at Disney wanted to get involved. And so I found myself now, whenever I wanted to pitch a new product, I'd have to face a group of about 12 managers, none of whom played games, all of whom wanted to show how important they were. And the way they would do it is always find a reason to say no. I remember I wanted to make a game based upon Epcot. Not the theme park, but Disney's original idea for the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. My idea was it would create the city of the future, and in it you would gather resources and research technologies and use those technologies to go build up things in your city, kind of grow your city, make people happy, and just all about measuring the happiness and the health and the prosperity of your city. And when I presented the idea to the managers, I said, how do you win? And I said, well, there really is no winning. It's all about you just creating a society by experimenting technologies. And they said, nobody would be interested in that. Forget it. We're not approving the project. Next year, Sid Meier came out with Civilization. My idea wasn't as good as his, but it just showed could have been good. After 6 months of not being able to get a product approved, I left Disney and then went to join a small developer for CDI, CD Interactive, which was a really terrible early console system. Worked there for 2 years. Then the partners split up and decided to disband the company. Then I got a call from a company called Cyberdreams, a small publisher that specialized in developing games with famous names from science fiction and fantasy. So like H.R. Giger created the look of the film Alien, Harlan Ellison, who wrote I Have No Mouth, I Must Scream. And they hired me as a producer. They were already working with Harlan, and they decided to put me in charge of the project. I was so excited because not only was I Have No Mouth, I Must Scream my favorite short story of all time, also the script he wrote for Star Trek, City on the Edge of Forever, was my favorite Star Trek episode. So I was real excited about the idea of working for him. And I remember my very first meeting with him. I drove over to his house. It was kind of a middle-class house. Once again, I thought I'd be meeting someone rich. No, it's just a middle-class house. The only thing distinctive about it was all along the roof were stone gargoyles, protected by razor wire. Reason why is apparently a lot of people tried to steal the gargoyles. I started just showing what I was creating and telling him how I was going to achieve his vision, and talked about my work on The Prisoner, and that was kind of similar to what he was trying to achieve. And so we established a working relationship. I had to teach him a little bit about game design principles, working out the story so they had more of a puzzle aspect. It was a really great working experience with him. We did publish the game and wound up winning a lot of awards. I was also working with H.R. Giger at the same time. We were developing another adventure game that actually I thought was even better than the one with Harlan. I hired another writer to write a story behind it. The person I hired was a writer who worked on a lot of Infocom's text adventures. He eventually wound up being one of the official James Bond writers, Raymond Benson. He did what I thought was a really great story. We were doing a sequel to an original Giger game that Cyberdreams had done, Darkseid, and we were making Darkseid 2. I thought it was a much better story, where the main character, Mike Dawson, goes and he's slowly going crazy and he goes off to this dark world. That's this Giger-esque world. And we were trying to chronicle someone breaking down and becoming insane. When we went to do the voiceover recordings for it, I purposely picked an actor who I thought sounded like he was going insane. What I forgot was creating the right player experience. I was so busy trying to create interactive literature that I really didn't pick up on the fact that the voice was annoying. Some of it just wasn't fun for the player. And so, whereas I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream got a lot of awards, Darkseid 2, well, let's put it this way. One reviewer called up our marketing manager and said I should be fired for producing a game like that. Again, you get your ups and your downs. Sometimes you hit it, sometimes you don't. And we had a mixed history. After a couple of years there, the owner of Cyberdreams, he owned a number of different businesses, decided to shut down the company and focus on another business. So then I was trying to figure out what to do next when I get contacted by a former programmer who worked at Cyberdreams, who was now working at 3DO's New World Computing studio, where they made Heroes of Might and Magic, which was a very popular fantasy turn-based strategy game. They brought me on to interview me. They wanted me to produce the next game in the series, Heroes of Might and Magic 3. I was familiar with Heroes of Might and Magic 2, which was considered at the time to be one of the greatest turn-based strategy games ever made. So it was both an exciting prospect, but a terrifying one. There's nowhere to go but down when you're making a sequel to a classic game. I took the game home and I started playing it. It was a really great game, really fun to play. But what I realized was the graphics were about 5 years behind the time, in my opinions. So I thought, this is one thing that I can do. I can go try to improve the graphics, bring it up to date. Told the management at New World that, and they actually agreed. And then they were also teaming up with a game designer who they had hired on the same day, and I had never met before. They hooked me up with a programmer who worked on Heroes 2, so I assumed he was the lead programmer. No, it turned out he was a junior programmer. So that was my starting team. Oh, yes, and by the way, New World Computing, owned by 3DO Company, run by Trip Hawkins, the founder of Electronic Arts, company responsible for ending my business. There were some hurdles getting started there. Turned out it was okay working with Trip. Like bygones begot bygones. First thing I did was bring in some new programmers. I brought in 2 programmers that worked on I Have No Mouth on My Screen, brought them on, slowly started building up the team. And then I went through the art department, kind of on the pretext of just getting to know people. I just had little conversations with them. I was really interviewing them, but they thought I was just having conversations. Every person I talked to, they loved it here, thought they were doing a great job. Everything's wonderful. Great job. Everything's wonderful. Finally came to an artist who said, everything here sucks. The work they're doing is terrible. They could be doing a lot better. People are slacking off. Quality of the art could be improved. And I thought, I found my art director. And as it turned out, she was also the best artist in the company. So I made her my art director. We worked for 14 months on the game. Don't have any great stories about developing the game. It was just a really great team. And everyone meshed together really well. And we produced Heroes of Might and Magic 3. And when it got released, most of the fans thought it was even better than Heroes of Might and Magic 2. So I kind of dodged that bullet. And then the company was kind of built around making 2 games at once. That's kind of the size of development team we had. 3DO was losing money. Our parent company was losing money like crazy, and they needed more product. So they had us developing 3 games, which we really didn't have the resources for. And a lot of my resources got pulled away when I was making Heroes of Might and Magic 4. And in fact, we worked for almost a year on the product with just 2 programmers when it really needed 6. And we fell behind schedule, and the general manager of the company quit. Suddenly, here we were, and he made promises that we were going to deliver on time, even though we didn't have the staff to make it. After he quit, they came in to investigate, found out we were way behind schedule, and suddenly things got very tense, and they brought in a boatload of people to come assist at the very last moment. How many of you are familiar with the principle that 10 programmers working in 1 month can't do the work of 1 programmer in 10 months? It doesn't work that way. 3DO thought it could. So they brought in a ton of programmers trying to get it done all at once, try to get it shipped on time. We did ship it a couple months late, but the game turned out terrible as a result. Heroes of Might and Magic 4 was kind of a disappointment for a lot of the fans. It was good enough to get good reviews, but it wasn't what the fans really wanted. And it wasn't enough to save 3DO itself. 3DO went out of business. Once again, I was deciding what to do next. When the former game designer for Heroes of Might and Magic 3 said he had a friend at Activision, and they were looking for someone to produce a Star Trek game. Finally, this has been 20 years since I made my Star Trek game in college. Finally got a chance to do a Star Trek game. I went to interview, got the job. We were going to make a real-time strategy game based upon Star Trek. Now, Activision, at least the division I was working for, we only worked with third-party studios. We didn't have any Activision-owned studios that we worked with. I was attending E3, and we were meeting developers there. We found a really good development team based in Hungary, Budapest, Hungary. They had a really good 3D engine. So I contracted them to develop the game. They were really great to work with. I got to spend some time flying out to Budapest. I knew nothing about the city or the country before, but really beautiful country. Really enjoyed working with them. They put together a really great prototype. What Activision does, the way it works, it's set up, it has this green light process where games are in development. There are certain stages. There's contract signing. Then there's the production stage where you develop all the documentation. You develop the game design document, technical design document, maybe a technical prototype. Then a first playable that shows off the initial gameplay. You got to prove where it's fun. An alpha version where it's feature complete, but all the assets aren't done yet. The artwork, all the levels, and all the audio isn't necessarily done. A beta version where all the content's done, but it may have bugs, and then a final version. Well, at each of these stages, the producer goes and meets with the executive management to show off the game, and they decide whether or not they'll fund it to the next step. So all along the way, it has to get greenlit. And I had it at prototype stage, and I went and showed it off, and they were very happy with it. In fact, the vice president of my division said that it was the best prototype he had seen in his 12 years at Activision. And then Star Trek Nemesis came out, and it bombed in the box office. And Star Trek Enterprise came out, and it bombed in the ratings. And then Activision said to Paramount, "You are not supporting the Star Trek license with good product. So we're going to tear up our contract with you and cease production on all Star Trek products." Anyway, so my Star Trek game I always wanted to make got canceled.
What age was your Star Trek game at when Activision was like, we're just going to tear it?
First playable, a 15-minute version of gameplay, vertical slice of gameplay. They shifted me over to another game in development that had actually been in development for like a year and a half, but it was kind of spinning its wheels. And that was Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which was based upon, if you've played it?
Oh, yeah.
All right, good game. The problem was that they were... it was being developed, it was based upon the game engine that Valve was developing for Half-Life 2, which was also being developed at the time. Never build a game around a engine that's in development. Because the problem is, every time they made a change in the engine, it invalidated months of work. Everything had to be redone. In fact, if you're developing a game, pro tip, try to narrow down your uncertainties. Try to keep to one major uncertainty. We had three. One was that it was an engine under development. Two was it was going to be a mixed genre game, half shooter, half role-playing game. So that's another uncertainty. Third is that the game developer we had, Troika Games, same team that made the original Fallout game. So really good team. But when they were working at Interplay, they spun off on their own. They had developed a reputation of never completing their work. That is, never finishing any feature, tweaking it till the end, up until the time it's ready to ship, and as a result, very buggy. So my job was to get the game on track, basically get them to finish up stuff. Let's finish up this feature before